Well, welcome to our class this week as we talk about ethics in research. And I'm going to digress a little bit from the textbook. I'm going to give you a little bit of the overview of how we've gotten to the place that we are as relates to the protection of participants of research. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of history, and then we'll get into some of the protections that have been put into place for those that are involved in research studies.
Of historical events that occurred that showed the need to come up with ethical standards and principles. And you can read these in detail. The Nazi experimentation during World War II. The Tuskegee syphilis study is another example, as well as human radiation experiments. So I encourage you to read through those specific issues as related to ethics in the area of research. Ethical standards were needed to protect the research participants. The first set of guidelines were established in 1947, Nuremberg Code. In 1964, the Helsinki Declaration as to dealt with medical research. The Belmont Report came out in 1979, and this was a fundamental document for current federal regulations for the United States. And then in 1991, there were federal rules established that governed research involving human participants in the United States. And then the need to create institutional review boards, we call them IRBs. The basic principles from the Belmont report included respecting the person and proclaimed that individuals were capable of self-determination, and thus voluntary consent was essential before research could be conducted. As far as benefits, it obligates researchers to maximize potential benefits and to minimize potential harm to the participants. The idea of justice requires that the benefits and the burdens of research be fairly distributed. The idea of informed consent is arguably the most important ethical standard established. It basically refers to telling the research participants about all aspects of the research study that might reasonably influence their decision to be a participant in the study. Four important elements included: subjects are made aware of the nature and the purpose of the research project. The consent is voluntarily given. The person has a legal capacity to give the consent. And the responsibility for obtaining the consent really lies with the researcher. So the idea of an informed consent for the participants is very, very crucial. There's also, when we talk about ethics, the protection of especially vulnerable subjects. So particular precautions should be taken for all subjects, but especially those that would be considered more vulnerable or at higher risk. And this would include subjects that might be children, the handicapped, cardiac rehab patients, welfare recipients, prisoners, pregnant women, maybe patients in a mental hospital, would be considered a higher risk group, and particular precautions should be granted to them. Another area of ethics is the need for privacy and confidentiality. To provide privacy just means that you're going to allow individuals to control when and under what conditions others have access to their behaviors, beliefs, and values. Confidentiality refers to treating subject information in a manner so it's not linked to any specific individual. It can't be traced back to any one person who participated in the study. When we're doing single subject research, this is a very important area. And again, we usually address privacy and confidentiality through the informed consent form that is presented. I mentioned IRBs, or institutional review boards. Every institution is required to have one as it conducts research. It was established by the federal government to assure compliance with governmental regulations as related to research, conducting research. IRBs have authority to approve, require modifications, or even disapprove research being done at their institution. IRB's approval requires before any aspect of the research involving subjects can take place. So you must have IRB approval before beginning your research study. Several criteria for the IRB approval, things that have to be included. First of all, any risks to subjects is minimized. Also, another criteria is that the risks to subjects are reasonable in relationship to the benefits. The selection of subjects is equitable, again, in relation to the purpose of the research and the setting. The informed consent is sought from each prospective subject, or if they're underage, their legal representation. Informed consent will be appropriately documented. Provisions for monitoring data collection to ensure the safety of the subjects, and also provisions to protect privacy of the subjects and to maintain confidentiality of the data. So an IRB board would require these criteria be met before an actual research study can begin. There's disclosure of results. Usually as you do a research study, you have some disclosure of results of the study. You publish it, you present it. And so the ethical obligation here is not to disclose inaccurate, deceptive, or fraudulent results of your study. And to do so would undermine the very nature of the scientific process. So there's an expectation of integrity and honesty as you present the results of your research study. Also, proper establishment of authorship is required. And according to the United States Public Health Service, they would identify scientific misconduct as a fabrication, a falsification, plagiarism, and other type of practices that would seriously deviate from those that are commonly accepted within the scientific community for proposing research, for conducting research, and for reporting research. So this is serious business to make sure that as we do research, we're ethical in our research from the very beginning to the very end. We have ethical obligations in our research. As a researcher, I'm responsible for my subjects. I'm responsible for my actions and those of my aides helping me. I'm requiring subjects to provide informed consent. I'm protecting my subjects from harm, danger, and discomfort. I'm maintaining anonymity and confidentiality. I'm not coercing my subjects or forcing them to do anything they are not comfortable with. And I have responsibility after the investigation to safeguard the data that I collect. And then to provide an honest disclosure of the results.
Into the chapter 5 in our textbook now. So as a professional, there's a level of ethical conduct that is expected of you. And here's a definition of scientific misconduct. It will be any fabrication or falsification or plagiarism in proposing, performing, or reviewing your research, or in reporting research results. That would be the definition of scientific misconduct. And specifically, here are the 7 areas of scientific dishonesty. First of all, the area of plagiarism, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but that's the idea of using other people's ideas and writings, even drawings, and you're taking them as your own rather than they belong to somebody else. That's why it's important to make sure you document whatever is not yours. Also, another area of scientific dishonesty would be you fabricate or you falsify your data. Third area would be you just don't publish some data because it doesn't fit into what you think should happen. Sometimes we call this cooking the data. Another area of scientific dishonesty is just you're not careful and there's faulty data gathering procedures or poor data storage and retention. All these areas would be considered scientific dishonesty. Moving on to number 6, you could have misleading authorship. Often you'll see more than one name on a journal article. You have to decide who should be the author, who contributed to it. Often technicians are not necessarily considered joint authors. And if you include somebody in the authorship, then they should have been involved in the actual research process. It's probably a good idea if you get into joint publications to talk about this before you get into the actual project. And then the 7th one is just sneaky publication processes. A lot of times graduate students do all the work and faculty will get credit for it. So it's just getting easy to make sure that you're handling things in a professional, honest way as you get into writing and conducting research. So I hope this has been helpful to you. Again, just a nice overview of making sure that we're protecting people who are involved in the research process. Also, that we as professionals are conducting research in an ethical way.